How's it going, everybody? We're joined by Matthew here on a blessed Sunday evening. I hope you all had a great weekend, ready for the week, and we're coming to you with some Western Rite Orthodoxy. This is something, just as a little introduction, that I've personally been very interested in. Back when I lived in Florida, I was blessed to have a Western Rite parish about 2 minutes away from my church, which is very rare because there's not many of them. And the liturgy was just glorious. I talked with the priest many, many times to sort of get what the deal was about Orthodoxy in general, and specifically Western Rite Orthodoxy. But as especially as an Ordinariate Catholic, it's interesting to see how the Orthodox are appropriating the same sort of tactics and theology of bringing back into the fold of their church some of those liturgical traditions that have been lost through, I won't say schism, but through because that would impugn myself, but through unhappy disagreements. So introduce yourself, Matthew.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I have my name is Matthew Emerson, and I'm literally a guy sitting at my gaming computer in my bedroom. So I want to invalidate myself before I say anything. I had thought about maybe sitting in front of a bookshelf or something to give myself some level of credibility, but I have none. I'm a guy in a pew that, in my exploration of Orthodoxy, read a lot about Western Rite Orthodoxy. I'm friendly acquaintances with a Western Orthodox priest, and I've been to Mass several times. I say all of that if I say something stupid, you can completely dismiss me as just a guy in a pew. And if I say something brilliant, you'll say, "Wow, how humble that guy is." And so, that's my tactic. But the intersection of psychology and religion is my kind of wheelhouse. I'm a therapist and mental health worker by trade, but being raised Roman Catholic, which is what I was, I went to Catholic school, and I say that happily, not like a lot of people who I went to Catholic school and here's why gay marriage needs to be okay. But I went to Catholic school, preschool, parochial school, high school, and I went to a Christian undergraduate university, but it was Presbyterian affiliated, and that's where I encountered Orthodoxy. And then my senior year of college, I left the Church of Rome for. I was chrismated in a Serbian parish, but I attend the Orthodox Church in America. That's where I'm a parishioner at.
Yes, because we actually a little bit before I converted, we had a little bit of
we spoke
discourse back and forth, and we spoke on the phone. I was asking about Western Rite Orthodoxy as particularly interesting for me. I never obviously decided to become Orthodox, but still, it's a very interesting phenomenon for myself, if I want to put it that way. But it's also, I think, a vehicle for ecumenical dialogue, although that term is so often abused.
Very loaded.
Very loaded term, but it truly is. I believe that when you're having it just in the same way of Eastern Catholicism, you're validating our liturgical patrimony, and that can ease the effort for reunion itself, which I think is a very important function of Western Rite Orthodoxy, Eastern Catholicism, and then everything in between.
Yeah.
So do you want to at first kind of just go over the bare knuckles basic of the origins of Western Rite Orthodoxy, and then maybe we'll get into a bit of the liturgical patrimony of how that looks, and especially in my interest, its relation to Anglicanism, because from my understanding, it was a bit related. Then maybe we'll get into a little bit of the theological distinctives, because that's going to be kind of where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. So obviously, both sides of the Adriatic, as I say, were united for longer times than others during the first 1,000 years. So much all of that, and much of the Western liturgical patrimony that traditional Catholicism knows of today existed during the 1,000 years of union. Even that's kind of a loaded term, but so it falls away. The West falls away from Orthodoxy, at least as we would narrate it.
Yes.
But over time, especially the late 1800s, you're starting to see, because of the Industrial Revolution, immigration happening. You have immigration going into parts of Europe, in France. I'm going to say right now, I know there is a history of a Western Rite Orthodox church in France. I don't know much about that. I know it existed. I think it still kind of exists. I believe it traces its heritage to like the Gallican movement in some way. I don't know much about it, and most of the sources on it I don't think are in English, so I
Yes.
can't speak much to that.
I've heard a little bit about that too, which is interesting because a lot of times we think of Western Rite Orthodoxy as merely like what's that one? Diverse Other Monks. The ones
Mhm.
in England, they have a
Yeah.
lot of good stuff, very interesting stuff. I'd suggest you guys check it out. And then you also have the American movement
Mhm.
too, but it's not only English Western Rite
Yeah.
Orthodoxy, but there was actually a French movement I was reading about, and that was really interesting that this isn't only an American English phenomenon like the Ordinariate, but it's truly throughout the entire West.
Yeah. And as the Orthodox are coming out of the Turkish captivity,
Hmm.
we are being forced to, um, or just having the opportunity to kind of interact with the rest of the Christian world. 1453 happens, and we have to hunker down. At least, much of the Mediterranean Orthodox do. We lose the Alexandrian and Antiochian Patriarchate. Centuries before that. And Slavic Orthodoxy is still kind of this blossoming, burgeoning civilization, and you have the whole problem with Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy, and we'll table that. But they come into the 1800s, and in particular, the Anglicans are huge in this whole narrative.
Hmm.
In the 1800s, the Church of England makes movements to consider communion with the Church of Russia.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm assuming that's coming from the kind of Tractarian movement because
I'm assuming
you're having
so.
a lot of stuff. I think I can't remember exactly. I think John Keble wrote a whole history
Mhm.
of, at least attempted to write a whole history of Eastern Orthodoxy, and that makes sense according to Tractarian ecclesiology and
Oh yeah.
viewing that. And that dialogue continues for over a century
Yep.
until the 70s when the Episcopal Church falls away. This is a
And
long time.
yeah, so Orthodoxy arrives on American shores. And notoriously in the early 1900s, you see the image circulated around Twitter pretty regularly.
Mhm.
The Orthodox presence in America, I should say, particularly in New York and stuff like that, starts to interact with the Episcopal Church primarily. You have photos of, I can't, is it St.
Bishop
Raphael?
Grafton. It's
Bishop
Bishop
Grafton
Grafton
and
with Saint Raphael
yes,
of
St. Raphael of
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, and
Mhm.
famously appearing on consecrations, and there was very strong language of inter communion, especially if the Orthodox could get the Episcopal Church to drop that Protestant Episcopal Church,
Yeah.
and open its doors. And then the Russian presence in America, the first thing you're going to see is Saint Tikhon of Moscow publishes or approves, because there are groups of Episcopal Christians in the early 1900s who actually do want to come into full communion with Orthodoxy, but they want to retain their heritage. And Saint Tikhon of Moscow takes a look at the 1928 Book of Common Prayer produced by the Episcopal Church, adds some Marian stuff to it, stamps it, more or less. Is like, there you go. I
And
have it.
takes out the 39 articles.
Yes, and though interestingly enough, at least the way that Lancelot Andrews Publishing publishes it, it actually has the Roman canon attached to the back as an
Mhm.
appendix, and it has a Gallican canon. I think it has a couple like other Western canons like as appendices in the back.
Yeah.
But it has like morning, evening prayer. It mentions, if I remember correctly, like Charles the Martyr, like on like,
Yeah.
where they aren't saints, but these are like respected figures of the Western liturgical tradition. I think is kind of how the Saint Tikhon prayer book mentions them. They don't have collects or anything. They are not
Yeah.
commemorated, but they go, if you happen to look on January 30th, St. Charles the Martyr is commemorated, and it's like,
wow, I hope the online Orthodox won't see this video. We're about to get blown up.
I mean, it exists, and I have found on average the Western Rite Orthodox, those who are born into it, because there are now generations being born into it, where people only know Orthodoxy from a Western perspective, which is really interesting, sociologically speaking. And then those who have converted into Western Rite Orthodoxy tend to be the Orthodox with the most favorable opinion of the West and the most favorable narrative of the relationship between Western Christians and Orthodoxy. Not that there are Easterners with very favorable opinions. I think I would consider myself one. But I highly recommend the podcast on the Areopagus has a great episode on anti-Westernism in Orthodoxy, and Father Patrick Cadine, Cardine, I always mess up his last name. He was influential in my conversion to Orthodoxy, and he is a Western Rite priest in Bealton, Virginia, at St. Patrick's Orthodox Church, which is kind of like the shining gem of Western Rite Orthodoxy. He is on that episode. It's fantastic. But anyways, St. Tikhon kind of approves that. St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco interact slightly with Western Rite Orthodoxy, and there's a very famous quote of his where the liturgy of the West is far older than her heresies, and no one should ever say that you must be Eastern in order to be Orthodox. He was very favorable. I even think he presided at some Western Rite services, if I remember correctly. There are like a couple obscure photographs of him doing that. But then it kind of dies out again. Obviously, like the majority of Orthodoxy in America is immigrants, and there's no need to make a Western Rite for Russian immigrants.
Yes.
And any of the parishes that are actually doing mission work are bringing them into an Eastern context. So, and a lot of these people, especially lower church Protestants, don't need a Western liturgical context, so they're just happy to become Eastern Rite Orthodox.
They're happy to have a liturgy.
Yeah, I am a dear friend of mine. He was Pentecostal his entire life, and he converted to Orthodoxy. And he'll hear myself and my other friend lament or like miss our Western liturgical heritage, and talk about that. And we talk about how, like, we're in the West. It'd be nice if we had a Western Orthodox kind of like church or presence or something like that. But he often says, if I walked into a traditional Latin Mass or the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, they are both just as foreign to me. Like, for him, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom isn't Eastern at all. It's just Orthodox, just as much as the TLM wouldn't have been Western to him. It would have just been the liturgy that he experienced first. Because we now have Christian groups that are so detached from liturgy and so detached from theological patrimony that something I've been chewing on a bit, which is kind of, I don't know, hypocritical for the topic that we're speaking of. I sometimes find West and East arbitrary adjectives anymore at this point, because even going to a liturgy of St. John Chrysostom parish, I'm a thoroughly Western person. Even cradle Orthodox in the West are Western Christians. Like, even if they practice what we consider an Eastern form of Christianity or Eastern form of theology. The major Western Rite presence that we're going to see, or that anybody would walk into now in the modern day that's even kind of relevant, is there's the ROCOR, Western Rite Vicariate, which exists, but I don't know if it's continually being promulgated, and I have my problems with it. And then the larger one of it is the Antiochian Western Rite Vicariate, which is fantastic. That is where St. Patrick's in Bealton, Virginia, is in the Antiochian, under the Antiochian Patriarchate. And they're beautiful. They're lovely. Both of those groups, you have two options. If you're going to be Western Rite, you're either going to use St. Tikhon's prayer book, which again is going to be the more Anglican expression of Western Rite Orthodoxy, or you're going to use the liturgy of St. Gregory the Great, which is more or less the English version of the TLM. And your office is going to be the Benedictine monastic diurnal. That is what they use, or at least that's often what that's what they sell at St. Patrick's. And there actually is a Western Rite Benedictine monastery in America, in Colorado. It's called Ladyminster. And there's a couple monks out there, and they're really good. They actually have an oblate tradition. So like if you're Orthodox and you want to be a Benedictine oblate, you actually have that opportunity. But that's where you're going to the ROCOR Vicariate, which they have just as much as the West Latinized the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church, or at least some of the Eastern Catholic churches were Latinized. ROCOR Easternized the West more than the Antiochians did.
Yeah.
So that's going to be your major distinction. Or again, I hate to use rules of I hate to use generalities, but I think that's a pretty fair divide.
Yeah. So so we're kind of going over the history a bit, but with the genesis of Western Rite Orthodoxy, was it mostly convert groups of I'm assuming Episcopalians in Church of England, or was it like Easterners who just happened to want some Western Rite?
I mean, for it to even get off the ground, it obviously had to have Eastern support, because the majority of the Orthodox Church is the whether I like it or not, the Eastern Orthodox Church is the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
So it's going to need that support, but primarily it comes from Protestant. If you look up orthodoxwest.com, they have tons of resources. It's primarily produced by the people from St. Patrick's. Again, I can't sing their praises enough. I love them dearly.
I read some of the articles there. They're great.
They're fantastic. I mean, they defend the Sacred Heart devotion, anything my little Catholic heart loves. So any of the Romanides types, I just send them journal articles from there, and I'm like, I'm perfectly justified in any of my opinions. And but they have a great just 30-minute documentary on the Western Rite. And basically, one comes from an Episcopal background, one comes from a charismatic Episcopal background, and one comes from a low church Protestant background that just started to discover liturgy, and then they all kind of brought their parishes into, they desired to keep this patrimony. The Antiochians were kind of willing to have that conversation. I say this in a positive light. I think the Antiochian Patriarchate is one of the most forward-thinking groups in Orthodoxy today, in a good way. They're the most progressive in a good way. And I mean, they have ancient faith, which is, they host anybody from any jurisdiction, but it is the Orthodox media publishing group at this point. I think they're geniuses, and their openness to flirt with the Western tradition, I really, really appreciate, because you see there's so much skepticism. I remember the Serbian church I was chrismated in, there was some pushback on the existence of the Western Rite, and you should probably just kind of stay away from that, and again, they mean well, but it's just a mindset that the Orthodox need to be broken from, that everything in the West is suspect or anything like that. It's primarily liturgical Protestant groups. You'll have Catholic converts. I do not know of any Catholic parishes that have been left Rome and fully received. I do know of Catholic converts who left and became Western Rite Orthodox, where you have the opportunity. Honestly, though, for some your Catholic viewers, the Antiochian Western Rite Vicariate is equivalent in size to the FSSP in America. That's a pretty good equivalency. The amount of FSSP parishes is about the size of the Western Rite parishes in America.
Yeah, I was just about to kind of ask, because it seems like most of the liturgical patrimony is coming from specifically Anglo-Catholic sort of groups, sure. Kind of Anglo-Catholic, and then washed with a little bit of Orthodox theology to make sure they're not screwing up. Especially even with the Gregorian canon you're talking about. That was something which was in the English and the Anglican, which is the American version, missal. That was one. And I'm assuming they just took it full sail from that. So it doesn't seem like it's coming from the Latin Church per se. It's coming from the Anglican Church.
The trad types obviously like it, because you're going to feel at home. You don't get your Latin, but I mean, St. Patrick's and Bealton, which again, I'm going to use them as my test. If you're going to look at something, it's of my opinion, you should look at the best examples of it rather than the worst examples of it. And St. Patrick's is, in my opinion, basically one of the best. I mean, they have Vespers Saturday night. with Eucharistic exposition and benediction, you know, and they sing the Tantum Ergo. They just kind of change they just change the Filioque part a little bit, you know, but you know, it's beautiful. I mean, they use Gregorian chant. They have several beautiful albums of chant and hymns that I think are all on Spotify actually, and you know, they're just fantastic. And the Antiochians are very, again, forward thinking, or I think very kind, especially when larger groups wish to enter into the Antiochian Patriarchate, and they're specifically the like American branch of it. They're actually given the option: do you want to come in as a Western Rite parish, or do you want to come in as an Eastern Rite parish? And the parish decides. It's not just like you have to be Eastern Rite. They can actually request, we want to come in as a Western Rite parish, or we want to come in as an Eastern Rite parish.
Okay.
Again, on average, most people come in Eastern Rite because, like, when you Google Orthodoxy, that's what you're going to see firsthand.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Orthodox people who don't even know the Western Rite exists. You know, it's such a small. But there are plenty of Latin Catholics who have no idea what an Eastern Rite Catholic even is. So
yeah, that is really sad. But it seems
especially
like
an Ordinariate, like, you know, it's like, what's that? Like,
yeah, what's an Ordinariate?
Yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of It was funny. I was this is kind of an aside, but I saw this like when you know who Bishop Stephen Lopes is, right?
Oh yeah.
The Bishop of the Ordinariate. When he was elected for a spot on the
the Council of Bishops.
The Council of Bishops for their liturgy spot, because he's a liturgist, like actually went to college for it and basically wrote our liturgies before he became the Bishop of the Ordinariate. And there was this like professor from, it was this Franciscan monk professor. He wasn't at Franciscan, but he was complaining like all of these disgruntled Anglicans. And now we have their bishop as our liturgy guy. Like, what the heck is going on? There's all these angry liberal Catholics like in the comments, like they should have just stayed Anglican if they were mad. Like, just be quiet. Just stop.
I mean, it's funny. I always made the joke. My priest is also a convert from Roman Catholicism. And so we still talk about it often. You know, him and I always made the joke about the Cranmer table, you know, in the Novus Ordo, and all that, because it's a fun rad trad mean comment. I find it funny. And we always joked about the Novus Ordo Missae, because you're like, it's just a badly plagiarized Book of Common Prayer. Like, if they wanted to make a vernacular liturgy, they should have just called up the Archbishop of Canterbury and was like, we're taking this and we're just going to use it now too. Like, if they wanted to strip down the TLM, at least take the good version of the stripped down.
Yeah,
TLM.
don't take like, because basically the 1979 prayer book is just a bad version of the Novus.
Exactly, it's just a bad version of the Novus Ordo. It's like, just take the 1662 and call it a day. Like, everyone would have been happy. I think.
Honestly, if they would have, this is my like rad trad English dream right here. If they would have just taken, if they wanted for English Catholics or English speaking Catholics, if they would have just taken the Anglican Missal, used like basically all the propers from the Tridentine Mass, like the canon of the Tridentine Mass, you basically would have had the TLM in English, in Elizabethan English. And everybody would have just loved it. It would have been beautiful and glorious.
Which that is more or less the Western Rite expression of St. Gregory's canon, of the Roman canon. Like it more, but again, as you said, it's descending more from the American, or the American Missal and the English Missal is where the Western Rite are taking their expression, rather than necessarily Latin Rite Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, I wanted to get into a bit about the specific liturgy of the Western Rite, but what kind of how different really is an Ordinariate expression from a Western Rite expression when it comes to the Mass? And then I believe there's a lot more differences when it comes to the, especially when it comes to the hours. That's where you get the big differences between us.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been to an Ordinariate parish, so I can't comment. Unfortunately, there is not one close to me. In terms of, from what I've read online of the Commonwealth Missal edition in particular, because what are the differences between the Commonwealth edition of the Ordinariate prayer book and like is there even an American version of that? Or
there is an American version, but I've just always used the Commonwealth, so I have no idea what the differences are.
Yeah, God save the Queen. So, so in terms of like liturgics, if you're going to look at the St. Tikhon's prayer book, it would just depend on how closely the Divine Missal follows the 1928. because that is where St. Tikhon is drawing from, and no one has taken the time or changed or updated it. It's just an Orthodox infused 1928.
Yeah.
And then for that, they have mourning. Actually, in that prayer book, now that I think about it, they do add like sext, prime, and terce or terce or whatever. They add that in the Orthodox 1928. I'll call it.
Now that I think about it, because I never went to a Western Rite Mass. I always had to leave before Mass to get back to my Anglican church. But I went to a lot of Western Rite Matins, usually once or twice a month. And now that I'm using the Ordinariate prayer book, there's actually a lot more similarities. But I've never been to a Mass, so I can't really compare the differences between an Ordinariate Mass and a Western Rite Mass.
And then again, like if you're going to a parish like St. Patrick's in Bealeton, they do Benedictine Matins. So from the Mass to Diurnal,
that will be much different.
And then again, their Mass is, for all intents and purposes, the TLM translated. And so, but if you're going to a much more English patrimony descended Western Rite Church, again, it would just I don't own a Commonwealth edition. I'm waiting for the next reprinting because I would like to get my hands on one. It depends just on how much it follows the older prayer books, or specifically the 1928, because that's what St. Tikhon's would follow. And then their morning prayer and evening prayer would look similar. Their Compline, I think they kind of take their Compline from the Benedictine office of some form. Like the Compline in that book is very much like the one you'd find in honestly kind of the 79 prayer book, all things being honest, but in like a good way. It's familiar to you. So those would be the similarities liturgically. A lot of Western Rite, people say the Rosary in their devotional life. There's a thing called the St. Ambrose prayer book, which is a nice little devotional. There's the St. Gregory prayer book that Ignatius publishes. It's kind of like the Western Rite Orthodox St. Gregory prayer book, but it's the St. Ambrose one. And it has the Gregorian Mass in it. And it has like daily devotionals and stuff. And it's stuff you'd find from, early 1900s trad Roman Catholicism. And I mean that in a good way. Just like as someone who knows all of that, my friend has that prayer book and I thumbed through it and I was like, I know all of this. It has the Angelus and St. Michael prayer and all those things.
That's very interesting. How in Orthodox theology is that justified to have Rosary and St. Michael's prayer and all of these devotions and prayers that were created after the schism?
That's a very complicated question, and I will do my best to answer it in some semblance of sense. Remember, guy in a pew. Say anything wrong, I'm just a guy in a pew. It depends on your narrative of it depends on your narrative of the schism.
Yeah.
I think most people agree that 1054 is very arbitrary. I have heard people push it back to 1204. I think that's better. To say that the realization of the schism happened later. Like I said, I once heard a tale, of the Pope sent the Alexios asks for the First Crusade to be called. Pope Urban II calls the First Crusade, sends the papal legate and some bishops with all the Crusaders to Constantinople before they head to the Holy Land. And when they show up, and note, this is only like basically 40, 50 years after the Great Schism happened. And there are instances of Western bishops showing up in the Eastern Roman Empire, and they're like, "Hey, why is the Pope not on the like the diptychs, like the commemorations?" And the Eastern bishops are like, "We don't know." And they just like write them back on, like it's just like a thought, And again, not to say that there wasn't genuine excommunications, but we also know the excommunication was invalid because the Pope died before it was even given. So it's a muddy thing. 1204, the sacking of Constantinople happens. The installation of a Latin patriarch in Constantinople is a slightly bigger deal because bishops being consecrated in bishops' territory is a telltale sign of schism in the early church, and so that's a bigger deal narratively that the Western Church is now consecrating Latin bishops where there are canonical bishops.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's arguments on both sides. I don't want to overly simplify the thing. Like I understand the complexities of it, but kind of moving forward, you have the attempted reunion Council of Lyon. That fails. Because then you have the Orthodox Council of Blackernay, which rejects that count, which rejects the reunion. You have the attempted Council of Florence, where Saint Mark of Ephesus, valiantly resists submission to the resists submission to the Pope, and actually famously writes the first. I just learned this not too long ago. Writes the first kind of Orthodox exposition of what happens to the soul after death. Because at Florence, Saint Mark was like, well, we don't believe in purgatory, and they were like, well, what do you believe? And he was like, well, give me a minute. Like, he was like,
yeah.
They knew purgatory was not the Eastern expression of the soul after death, and so when he returns after the council, he actually writes the first dogmatic. I don't mean that in like a ecumenical sense, but the first kind of theological exposition where he kind of takes from the fathers and goes, this is kind of the Orthodox explanation of purification of the soul and all that contra purgatory. But the problem is, I say all of this. St. Mark of Ephesus shows up at the Council of Florence, and he refers to the Pope with patriarchal honorifics and refers to the schism as a wall built within the church. So that's weird. So, like, that's 400 years after 1054 that we're still kind of talking like we're the church in schism internally.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of how much spice how angry do I want chat to get with me? Much like Constantinople and Moscow right now, where the Orthodox are, I would say this is a schism within the church. That seems to be how several contemporaries talked about Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates. What gets even more frustrating is even into the 1700s, in places like Venetian Crete, you see cross communion. You see Orthodox priests participating in Corpus Christi celebrations. Yeah. Now, again, I'm saying those are definitely exceptions, not the rule. But in many places of the Middle East where you go to the church that's not being bombed, and so Melkite Catholics might show up at the Antiochian church, and Antiochians might show up at the Melkite church, and they cross commune. Now, again, you could say that's an instance of pastoral provision, which it is, an instance of economia. I know the priest, one of the priests that chrismated me, there was a Coptic Orthodox Christian who is not in communion with Eastern Orthodoxy by any means, who had married a Serbian man. And there's no Coptic churches in where I live. And he would commune her because he said that where else is she going to receive any liturgy, even somewhat like her own patrimony and her own church? And again, economia, pastoral provision. My point being is for all of the people who try and make the schism very black and white and try and kind of make it like the minute 1054 happened, everything in the West is bad and we need to throw it all away. That is not how the Orthodox ever thought of the West in any way, shape, or form until very recently. Orthodox anti-Westernism is like an 1800s innovation, I would argue, at least from my reading and what my priest has told me, and from what I've read from like people like Dr. Marcus Plested and stuff like that, who he published Orthodox Readings of Aquinas. And so I say all of that to say the Western Rite policy and the Antiochian Patriarch's policy, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, has been, it's complicated, the history of the Western Church and its liturgical devotions post-schism, because it's sometimes hard to say when that happened. And if it is thoroughly Orthodox in practice, there is no reason to reject it. This will make you happy, you radical Newmanite. if it was in seed form in the West while we were in communion with one another, there's no reason to immediately reject it. If this seems to just be a nice organic development of a devotion and there's nothing uber heretical about it, there's no reason to make people reject it. And ultimately, grace works outside the canonical bounds of the church. We have baptized pagan practices. There is no reason we can't baptize schismatic Christian practices and make them Orthodox. I might get flame from both sides on
that was a really good response, because even I sometimes think about because obviously, like, the difference between me and, I don't know, a Presbyterian is a much even though Presbyterian schismed from, I guess you could say Presbyterian schism from the Anglican Church, but between me and a Lutheran, for example, that's a better example, is a much different situation than the situation between me and you.
Yeah.
It's like, what we're using schism in equivocal senses when we're talking about the relationship between me and you and me and him, and how are we going to terse out the exact situation. And some will have a much friendlier view of our relation, and then some people will just say, like, one of you is damned and the other one just too bad.
The way I was taught, it was there's the librarian at the college that I went to when I was an undergrad. He was one of the first Orthodox Christians I ever met. And he is still a mentor to me to this day. I still go over to his house for book club like every other week. I love him to death. Lives with his son. Like, he's great. When I told him that I want to convert to Orthodoxy, he pulled, I could still picture it. It was a snowy day, and we went to the third floor of the library and we just sat together. And he sat down, he told me every single thing wrong with Orthodoxy. He told me about the Moscow Patriarchate Schism. He told me about abuses. He told me about problems in the church. And he said, I refuse to let you become Orthodox if you are going to hate where you come from. And then he said to me, he said, if you remain Catholic or if you become Orthodox, we are children of divorced parents, and we should only approach that we want mom and dad to get back together. And that's how I have endeavored to always look at the schism, is that we are literally siblings of divorced parents. And unfortunately, mom says I can't come over for dinner. But that doesn't mean we can't still play. Like, it doesn't mean we can't go to the park or something like that. Yeah. That is how I will always try to approach the issue.
Yeah, that's a really good note to everybody, especially, I'm sure we have some Orthodox friends from your following that are in the stream, and then also a lot of
flatter me that I have a following.
And then also a lot of Catholic converts in the stream, because that's most of the people that are going to be interested about this. And I struggle with this myself, is being charitable and realizing the graces that were in your former church.
Yeah.
Is that you would not, most of you, unless you were pagans beforehand, would not have become Catholic if you weren't Anglican before. You would not have become Catholic if you weren't Lutheran before. You would not have become Catholic if you weren't Presbyterian before. Those certain those imperfect participations in the truth have led you to the fullness of truth. And that can be recognized as good while also recognizing the flaws.
Yeah.
So don't be out there 24/7 hating your former tradition. Critiquing, fine, go ahead. Want people to come into the fullness of truth, but that's completely different than just the hatred you see, especially among rad trad communities, and then also among online Orthodox, the Orthobro community, who are notorious for it.
That's why sorry to interrupt. I've become so tired with pop apologetics. It's something I honestly have really appreciated with your work, because you're still studying at like the Davenant Institute. You actually read the Protestants and have a respect for their intellectual giantness. They were not slouches by any means. I as weird as it might sound, and some of my close friends would really razzle me for this, I love John Calvin. I don't see him as a demon in any way, shape, or form. I am extremely sympathetic to the Reformed camp. working in the mental health field just makes you want to affirm total depravity. But one thing I get so tired of with pop apologetics and pop Orthodox apologetics against the West, one thing I really have tried to endeavor to do, it's like, there is a reason I'm not Catholic. There's a reason I left the church and became Orthodox. But I don't want it to be because Augustine bad. Like, I don't want it to be these dumb, stupid stereotypes or these perceived, theological differences or something like that between the two. There are issues that I found that eventually led me away from the Church of Rome, but I want them to be the real issues, not the, liturgy and all Latin bad, or anything, or Sacred Heart Nestorian or something like that. It's like, come on, like let's be honest with each other here.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move on from that brief rant, but
sorry about that.
No, I completely fed into that because that's just something that I despise is pop apologetics, because I mean, it's great if you're working against like Bethel, Hillsong, Elevation sort of groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy. Like, people who have no history or anything.
The people that I'm friends with and a lot of the people that I follow and the people that I read are not them.
Yeah.
So don't disgrace them and disrespect them by treating them like that.
I think about that. Think about this often. I've been working through For the Light of the World by Alexander Schmettman with some friends. And every once in a while they'll kind of make some comments towards Protestantism, and in my mind I'm like, any well-read confessional Lutheran or creedal Anglican could agree with everything being said here and feel no need to leave their respective communions. Like you're people on the Orthodox side or people on the Catholic side need to work a little bit harder if they want to convince these people that they need to leave and come to one of our apostolic communities. There's a reason you need to leave your bishop. There's a reason you need to, and I struggle with that with like the continuing churches. I do. I understand why they have no reason to, they feel oftentimes no reason to leave. I get that. You know, I was talking with a friend of mine. He's Pentecostal who became Orthodox, and he's a good zealous convert for Orthodoxy, and him and I butt heads a lot over my still love for the Western tradition and his cynicism towards papism and the like. But I've said to him, I have a couple books from Anglo-Catholics and stuff like that, or I have was a manual on the Catholic religion by Vernon Staley. And I said, if you read that and I didn't tell you who published that, you may think he was Orthodox. I was like, one or two phrases might trick you. One or two phrases might make you go, wait, what is he talking about? But if I blacked them out, just changed the words, you have no idea. You have no idea he was not talking about Anglicanism.
Yeah, especially with the Tractarian movement.
Oh yeah,
there is a very strong Eastern appropriation of the Eastern Fathers. Like you see it in John Henry Newman and his doctrine of justification.
Yeah,
and because Newman, his main scholarly field of research was the Arian crisis and the response of the Eastern Fathers there. So I think if you go to the Shaft set and you go to Athanasius and you look at who wrote the notes to that and who translated that, it's St. John Henry Newman.
Yeah.
And it's pretty crazy. But past that, now let's get, so everybody in the comments, if you want to ask questions, I'll go through the chat after we talk about this. If you have questions, throw them in the chat and we'll get them answered. But let's talk a bit about the theological differences. That's something that we haven't really covered. Like, as a Western Rite Orthodox, am I allowed to read Anselm? Am I allowed to read Aquinas? Am I allowed to read Banez? Like, where is this? Where's the line drawn of who I am and I'm not allowed to read?
You know, I mean, you have license to read anything. I'll cheekily say. In terms of freedom, it's actually funny you bring that up. So St. Patrick's, as I go with you, what was it? Last fall, actually had a conference on the atonement there, and it was great. I got to go, thank God. And we had mass, and the bishop who oversees the Western Rite was there. He was once a native Pittsburgher, so I love him. I feel camaraderie with him, and he was there. Dr. Marcus Pleston was there. Father Patrick Henry Reardon, who is a prolific Orthodox author, and he's at All Saints in Chicago, retired there. He was actually a student of Merton for a time, Thomas Merton. He was
really?
Yes. He actually got a STD, a doctorate in sacred theology, without a high school diploma. He just knows like 9 languages. When he is not serving the divine liturgy, he is praying the divine office in Latin. That is his prayer rule for himself.
Yeah.
He is just a giant, and he has a 2-volume set called Reclaiming the Atonement. If anybody wants to have a Orthodox appraisal, I would recommend them to that. His book Reclaiming the Atonement. But yes, Dr. Marcus Pleston was there, who he attends an Eastern Rite parish. He's a professor at Marquette University. He's an Orthodox Christian. He teaches in Marquette. And he's who published the essays Orthodox Readings of Aquinas. And he spoke on Anselm, and he spoke on another guy, a Saint Nicholas Cabasilas, who was a Greek theologian who wrote a commentary on the Divine Liturgy, and talked about rehabilitating Anselm in the Orthodox mind, because you will find plenty of Orthodox theologians who take issue with substitutionary atonement, or at least, especially penal substitutionary atonement. I would say there is, for what it's worth, again, I'm a therapist speaking on theological matters, but for what it's worth, I don't really find many ways to reconcile penal substitutionary atonement with Orthodoxy or the Orthodox theological tradition. I don't think that is going to happen. But there is definitely a much larger movement in Orthodox theology that is looking back at Anselm and going, maybe he does have some good things to say. And he's so close to when the schism happened. Like, oftentimes I find this, it's like, when thinking of those authors, I don't find a lot of my Orthodox people are going like, oh, what year was that? Oh, don't read them. It is typically about content. And again, I know that's anecdotal evidence, so don't quote me to the wider world. But I still read Aquinas. Gennadios Scholarios. Scholarios. He was Patriarch of Constantinople during the fall, and he went into Florence anti-union and left pro-union, though he eventually repudiates it. He flees the fall of Constantinople with a Bible and his personal translation of the Summa. And he is who famously said, of the students of St. Thomas, there is no more faithful son than I. I believe this quote is attributed to several people. Palamos is one of them. Scholarios is another. I think there's a third. I can't remember who it is. Who says the greatest tragedy of Thomas is that he was born in the West. Had he been born in the East, he would have been Christ's brightest star. Because he has to, for the East, he has to defend all of these. He has to go to great lengths to defend all of these Western innovations. And I think most people would agree against the Greeks is probably his weakest work. Because he's working on pretty poor translations. I think if he went to Lyon, he would have burned it, or at least rewritten it. Because if you actually just look at what Greek fathers say, or the Greeks say at the time, they are not saying what he says they're saying, which again isn't his fault. It's purely he had bad copies or was working on what people were telling him Greek Christians were saying. I wish he had the opportunity to go to Lyon or survive the trip to Lyon, I should say, and actually got to talk with Greek Christians. I mean, St. Mark of Ephesus, he was no anti-Westerner at all. He actually, there was, how in there's the Bosphorus Strait, there's Constantinople on the one side, and it was Adrianople on the other side.
Yeah.
On the other side of there, this is a leftover from the Latin Empire, there was a Dominican priory in the 1400s, and St. Mark of Ephesus studied there under the Dominicans. And he came to Florence with all of these scholastic texts defending Orthodoxy, ready to have a debate. And when he showed up at Florence and realized, oh, this is just like a please sign and leave kind of deal, that's when he became super anti-union, because he was there to debate, but the Latins were there to please just sign, what we said. But again, the problem being is the Latin dogmatic tradition had already kind of dogmatized things that Orthodoxy had left in open question. And so, the Orthodox were like, well, we're going to ignore all of that because those councils don't matter to us. And so let's have this debate and see if we can kind of hash these things out. But they couldn't, because the Latins, I don't say this meanly or rudely, kind of backed themselves into a dogmatic corner on a couple things. And so they weren't free to debate the issue as much as St. Mark or others may have wanted to. But I mean, you're free to read and appropriate anything. Again, I mean, I would happily recommend anybody to the book Orthodox Readings of Aquinas to see a fantastic modern Orthodox theologian reading him very positively. He has a couple of lectures on YouTube for free as well on the book. I think Reason Theology interviewed him at one point, if I remember correctly. I would say you're perfectly free. I mean, if you listen to Father Stephen DeYoung, who's made a lot of waves because of the popularity of the Lord of Spirits podcast, and his book Religion of the Apostles, and then God is a Man of War. If you read the Religion of the Apostles or listen to Lord of Spirits, they are going to take, I don't want to use the term anti-Anselmian, but that strand of thought in Orthodoxy is going to take a more anti-substitutionary atonement, but not arguing because it's bad, but arguing because it is disconnected from the Near Eastern understanding of sacrifice, and that by the time you get into 11th century England, they're kind of detached from the Near Eastern pagan / Second Temple Jewish understanding of the substitution of the sacrifice that Father Stephen argues Orthodoxy has retained. But then on the other side, you'll have people like Dr. Marcus Blested, who gets into the etymology of the word atonement, which is more at-one-ment. The word, I can't think of it right now, but the word in Greek, there's not a very good equivalent in
Hilasmos.
Yeah, there's not a very good English equivalent where they kind of invent the word at-one-ment or atonement as we come to know it today, and has looked back at what Anselm has to say and has said he actually did a lot of good things about at-one-ment with God and the purpose of the Atonement Conference, especially the rehabilitation of Anselm. Dr. Marcus spent a lot of time looking at substitutionary atonement grounded in the Eucharist rather than in the abstract. So the substitutionary atonement through the lens of the Eucharist rather than through the lens of the cross. Not that the Eucharist is divorced from the cross. Don't they'll pin me on that, but but looking at it from the transformative power of the Eucharist and how it does make you at one with God, which Dr. Marcus argued, and I agree with, is a better way to look at atonement. Ultimately, it is not atonement from sin, but at one-ment with God. And that Anselm actually pretty clearly has that strain of thought in his writing. So that's drawing a circle to make a straight line to say, I would say as any Orthodox Christian, probably even more so as a Western Rite Orthodox Christian, you're free to kind of read any thinker. I mean, I know plenty of Orthodox Christians who love Bonhoeffer, and I would find him more problematic than any of the early medieval scholastic theologians. Not that I think his death or his stand, I'm not questioning his character necessarily. I'm just saying, in terms of some of his theological opinions, way more problematic than the worst scholastic of the medieval era. And the problem is the Western Rite right now, because it's so young. Not that liturgy is not doing theology. Obviously, lex orandi, lex credendi. But you are not. I cannot think of any professional Orthodox theologian right now that is a Western Rite Orthodox Christian. They are still all going to be Eastern Christians going to an Eastern church. Though there are some that are more aware of the Western tradition than others. Again, that's where I think Father Reardon is so great. I mean, he was a student of Merton, and then he studies in Rome. I think he studies the Angelicum specifically, and then later in life he converts to Orthodoxy. And so he is very familiar with the 20th century Nouvelle Theologie and patristic ressourcement in Catholicism and Thomas and all that. So his Reclaiming the Atonement is truly fantastic. And I believe Ancient Faith is badgering him for a third, but I don't know if he intends to write it, because I think he made a joke in his lecture that he'll write it on the other side of eternity. So I don't know if he wants to do the work to make the third one, but a second one I think is currently in the revision process.
Okay, that sounds amazing. So let us get into the chat a bit. I'm gonna just go all the way up to the top and then see.
God have mercy on me. Yeah, I find it so funny. It is just a funny or good trick that I'm talking about Western Rite Orthodoxy and the Feast of Saint Photius, how he's rolling on his throne in heaven right now. I smirked at that when I went to liturgy today.
Okay, so so they're asking about icons in statues in Western Rite Orthodoxy. Do you guys have statues?
The at St. Pat's, yeah. I mean, they have a statue of St. Joseph. They have a statue of the Virgin Mary with Child, and then they also have icons. They have an icon of St. Patrick by the altar. They still have the Christ and the Theotokos and all that. So it depends where. A lot of Western Rite places are basically mission plants. And some of them aren't even operating in a real church building. So they kind of make do with what they got. But I think any like formal Western Rite building, you're going to see a mix of both. But I even think a lot of modern Catholic churches, and I don't mean that in the negative way, you see regularly, at least in my area, that you find the icon here and there and the statue here and there. They sometimes look out of place in the Gothic cathedral or something. I mean, St. Paul's, which is the Cathedral of Pittsburgh, has an icon of the protecting veil of the Theotokos over the city of Pittsburgh. It was an icon commissioned for the city, and it's a neo-Gothic revivalist cathedral. It looks like you picked it up out of France and dropped it in Pittsburgh. So you'll see both.
Okay.
I think it more depends on resources rather than like theological opinion or something. Statues are expensive.
Oh yeah. So can we get into the nitty-gritty of why the Orthodox Western Rite, when the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, is everywhere anyway?
I mean, well, ultimately, it's less a question as hard as this can be, especially for people who have strong liturgical preferences. Ultimately, the question is not, are you going to be a Western Rite Orthodox or a Catholic? It's, do you believe the Orthodox Church has preserved the apostolic deposit, or do you believe the Catholic Church has preserved the apostolic deposit? If you believe one or the other, it doesn't matter if a Ruthenian Catholic Church is the only thing near me. I'm going to go be that because I feel that I need to be in communion with the Pope of Rome. Or if I think that Orthodoxy is the true church, but by gosh, they'll have to burn me alive before I surrender my 1662 Book of Common Prayer, I'm going to have to go to an OCA parish or a Greek parish or an Antiochian parish, whether I like it or not, because I believe that's me. I was a TLM attending Catholic before I became Orthodox, and I had to give up my preference for what I believe to be the truth. And now it's a blessing if you have, especially in Bealton. I mean, now after the motu proprio, I don't know if this is true, but in Bealton, there was a Catholic church that offered a TLM, or near Bealton, I should say, who offered a TLM every Sunday. And I believe there's a Serbian Eastern Rite church in Fredericksburg, which is like 40 minutes from Bealton. And then there's the Western Rite church in Bealton. So that's that's the best of three worlds right there.
Yeah.
And at that point, again, not that practice doesn't matter. Something my fiance taught me, I used to very much treat myself as a brain in a jar. If you know the truth, you're going to follow it. There you go. That's all you really need. But, my fiance really taught me there's three dimensions to faith: truth, and what you believe, the doctrine, which should be the highest, I think, because God is truth. The practice of it, the liturgical life, the daily prayer life, and the community. You need to weigh all of those, honestly. As much as I want to believe that we are all very strong and committed to the truth, if you have a really good community, you might just not leave. And, that's between you and God. I'm not trying to be a relativist, but, at the end of the day, especially when it's is it my liturgical preference that's tying me to this church, or is it I believe X church has betrayed the apostolic deposit in some way?
Yeah. Okay, so there's the shortened answer from Scottish Slav: why be a papist when you can just be normal?
That is true. There you go. What more do I need to say? There you go.
Okay,
because the Slavs are so normal. I go to a Russian parish. I know how weird we are. Like, the bishop came, so we gave him bread and salt. What? Like I just
bread and salt.
No, that's like that's a tradition apparently. I was like, I love ethnic traditions. They're great. It's just...
People are arguing in the comments.
I'm sure. I mean, meanwhile, for me, growing up Catholic, it's like the bishop's coming. I wonder what money he wants now. Like that.
Okay, now they're asking about when I use the term apologetics. Is that like Trent?
I would defend him, honestly, of the Catholic Answers crew.
Yeah, and they're asking about Catholic Answers.
I would defend some of them, not all of them. I think a lot of the tracts and stuff that Catholic Answers puts out is overly simplistic in every way, shape, and form.
It's a tract, so...
Yeah, that's true. You know, but Trent Horn's Case for Catholicism, I will forever say, is one of the best apologetical works in the modern day in defense of Catholicism, in my humble opinion. I've read a lot. I think it's great. I adore it. I think Jimmy Akin is great on weird subjects. I think he is... I feel so terrible saying this because, again, I'm a guy in a pew. So I feel terrible saying this. But as somebody who has desperately tried to understand Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and knows Catholicism intimately because of my upbringing, and of trying to learn what I can about Orthodoxy from people who speak well of Orthodoxy, I do find Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin's apologetics towards Orthodoxy or apologetics for the papacy at time to be left wanting.
Yes.
Sometimes I feel that they are just repurposing their arguments against Protestants for the papacy for the Orthodox.
Yes.
And I mean, that was something that when I did as a Catholic, and it was eventually investigating the Orthodox Catholic debate over the papacy and realizing how different it is between the Catholic Protestant argument over the papacy. At least in my mind, I'm sure some higher church Anglicans probably would have similar disagreements with Rome that maybe Orthodoxy would have. But
yeah, I mean, the way in which the papacy was argued to me, if it was just a lot of this more pop apologetic stuff, I never would have converted. It really took basically the type of arguments that were being given against the Orthodox.
Yeah, I mean, you need that, you know, and so that's what I mean by pop apologetics. Is like, oh, Matthew 16:18, there you go. It's like, oh, okay, well, like let's not talk about what any of the fathers had to say about it. Like it just says Peter and keys, so I guess that means papal supremacy and papal infallibility. And I obviously, I'm not saying that's necessarily what they do, or like there are good Catholic defenses of that verse. I'm not saying there aren't. I just mean like the very simple tractates, or as you'll see, the Maquis joke, and stuff like that go around. You know, pop apologetics. I mean, overly simplified apologetics. But I love Trent Horn. I think he's great. I still listen to the council.
I won't name any specific names, but I'll just give a brief description, and you can fill in the sketch and apply to who you want. And I just won't name names. But it's just the type of apologist who uses overly simplistic arguments and that don't necessarily follow against the intended position, and then often conflates different groups. I think those are the general characteristics. And conflating groups is a huge one.
And have no familiarity with the sources of the opposite side. Like that's like, I want to tear my hair out often when I read, especially when I hear Orthodox talking about Augustine. I just want to tear my hair out. Because one, he's a saint on the liturgical calendar. So like, stop slandering a saint, and it just makes me want to tear my hair out. Or even Orthodox, because so many Orthodox converts from Protestantism are coming from extremely low church backgrounds. So even when they were Protestant, they could have given a damn what Cranmer or Luther or Calvin or then get into the more obscure Protestant reformers like Melanchthon or Bucer,
Bucer.
who's
Vermigli.
Matthew Pearson's guy, or like that guy,
Vermigli or Zanchi, or
so like they have no understanding of sources or any of that, and then feel like they can just knock down the arguments. It's like as if Sadoleto or Ignatius of Loyola were pulling punches with the Protestants. Like they were arguing from this. I mean, or look at John Jewel's defense of the Church of England, his thoroughly patristic defense of the Church of England. It's showing like here's how Rome erred from the fathers, not necessarily the scriptures all the time. And so it frustrates me very much.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the cardinal sin of the Pop apologist, at least Pop Catholic apologist, when it comes to arguing against Protestants, has to be the Eucharistic presence. Like, oh my gosh, yeah, goodness! Not
as
only
if they've never read John 6.
Yeah. Not only does you not understand the Protestant position. You'll have, I mean, a lot of the more modern Protestants saying Christ isn't present, but that's nobody else's position. But also, you don't understand your own position, because basically you're saying, okay, Christ is present, therefore transubstantiation. No. That's not what transubstantiation means. The two terms, while transubstantiation is a species of the genus real presence, the two terms don't equal each other.
Yeah, just
like this is my body. That doesn't necessarily conclude transubstantiation.
It's like somebody moves on to the real presence position. It's like, congrats, but like which one? You got to say like, what one are you looking for? Because there are tons of people who affirm real presence. It's just, how do you want to explain the real presence?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Corey actually has the psychology question for you.
Oh God help me.
Yeah, therapy question. So working in mental health, do you find the religious delusions of grandeur found in schizophrenics, manic bipolar patients to be of demonic influence? I believe it is.
It's funny that you asked that, Corey, because I was just talking with a friend about this. And the primary population I work with right now in the mental health field is people with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. Interesting people, and I love them. It's so awesome trying to help them, because it's difficult, but anyways, a lot of them are religiously fixated. Obviously, I think that's an aspect of the culture. A lot of people are raised religious, you're going to have that expression. I don't rule out the possibility that, because I don't know their history. I don't know if they ever messed with the Ouija board. I don't know if they ever consulted tarot or made a deal with the devil. And demonic possession does look a lot like schizophrenia. It's very hard to draw that line sometimes. I think that the Catholic process for
exorcism.
Yeah, for exorcism is very helpful.
They're intense. They're intense about it.
It's very helpful, and I actually, when I taught in college, I taught not a semester class, but I taught one class called Demons, Exorcism, and Mental Health. And I used the Catholic process to explain like how this kind of like works, because it's the most formalized, the most documented. But I don't wave out the possibility. But I mean, much like, and I think this is, I would say this is the position of Orthodoxy if it had one. I'd actually have to look that up, especially of even people like Father Ripperger or something like that in his like Introduction to the Science of Mental Health. I err on the side of it's a biological problem first, unless given a good reason to think that like demons or something are actually talking to these people.
Yeah. Okay. So California Condor asks, do you believe the Catholic Church has grace in it at all? And if yes, no, why?
Again, I also want to say I'm very thankful for all of these questions, but I have to keep reiterating, I'm just a guy in a pew. So my opinion matters very little, but I will try to speak what I think about the Orthodox Church has said on the matter. Yes, I do, but I do believe there's grace in the Catholic Church. I don't think that you can deny the incorrupt bodies of the saints, and I don't think you can deny the practice of the Russian Church is to receive Catholic priests by vesting. They don't reordain them. That's the practice of the OCA. Receiving Catholic converts, they are received by chrismation. They're not rebaptized.
Yeah.
Yes, I know rebaptism is a big controversy in Orthodoxy, and that's a big thing. You can't decide what to do, but we've never definitively decided.
St. Augustine has entered the chat.
Yeah, but I do believe there is grace, and there are several beautiful monastic stories of Athonite elders and Altina elders. They're basically apocryphal stories. I don't know if they're ever really true, but a pilgrim comes and asks, Holy Father, I have a friend, who's a papist, like I must save him from himself and all that. And the elder, is like, do they venerate the Virgin Mary? Yes, Holy Father. Do they receive the Eucharist? Yes, Holy Father. Do they venerate the saints? Yes, Holy Father. Then despair of your own salvation. Don't worry about, but then on the flip side, but if you abandon your orthodoxy for papism, you'll be damned. But I do believe there's grace. I think there's a great article. I cannot remember who wrote it. I just sent it to a friend on sacramental rigorism that circulated around Twitter not too long ago. And it's arguing against sacramental rigorism in the Orthodox Church and is arguing, and I think rather convincingly, that the position of the Orthodox Church is there's varying levels of grace in communions outside of the Orthodox Church. And it really needs to be understood on a case-by-case basis on how we're going to interact with these things. But there are several stories of monastics who refer to the saints of the Catholic Church and stuff like that. I know of an Orthodox priest who, on his private prayer icon wall, obviously not liturgically, but his private icon wall, he's an icon of Saint Jean Vianney because he just sees him as such an exemplar of the priesthood. Also, much like in Catholic practice, you can venerate your grandfather if you want to. There's no reason you can't, venerate anybody that you think is found to favor with God. The Orthodox actually even have it's kind of tragic, but in late 1800s Russian prayer books, they actually publish a prayer for orphans, and the orphan prays like, "Mom or Dad, if you have found favor with God, pray for me." And I find that to be a really good policy for Orthodox Christians or for myself who wants to venerate, Catholic saints or St. Charles the Martyr or something like that. This person, if you have found favor with God, pray for me. It's a perfectly good footnote to attach, and safe for anybody in any communion, that has, questionable things. But no, to say, I don't think it's a tenable opinion to say that everything outside of the Orthodox Church is devoid of grace, and I don't think that is the position of the Orthodox Church throughout the centuries. Nor do I think that is the position of the Catholic Church, even at the height of Unum Sanctum. I don't think that I don't think that Vatican II is in its position on other religions is in conflict with Unum Sanctum or anything like that. So, I think the Orthodox and the Catholics are actually in a lot of agreement there, at least in what Vatican II says about those outside of the bounds of the Roman Catholic Church. If people can find it or Google it, it's just on sacramental rigorism, and it's fantastic.
Well, if Militant Jamie is in the chat, please pull it up. So, Benjamin D, question for Matthew. Which books did you find useful in researching the papacy? It's frustrating trying to find scholarly works on the issue that are also affordable, and as I may add, in English.
Oh man, ain't that the bloody truth? Okay, for the first book I'm going to recommend, it's called His Broken Body. It's about the papacy. It's really just about all ecclesiological issues between East and West. Father Laurent Clearwick or Cleanwick, forgive me, Father, he wrote it. He's an Orthodox priest in the West Coast, and he studied in France. And it's great. It overviews the role of the local bishop and the role of the papacy and the sides of Greater Church. It is fantastic. It changed my view of everything, and it actually helped my spiritual life because it made me appreciate having a local bishop more. Like it's a great book. Was it Rome and the Eastern Churches is very good. The Papacy by Ab Gautet, Goutete. It's of some French name. There are some problems with it, but I still think it's good. It's good to read. Like he was a Roman Catholic monk in the 1800s who converted to Orthodoxy. The Primacy of Peter. There's a collection of different scholarly essays that John Meyendorff edited. Give me 2 seconds here.
Real time, we're live. Okay, just so everybody knows, after this, about 10-15 minutes after we're done this stream, I'll be having another stream and kind of continuing our discussion from on St. Thomas Aquinas on predestination, and we'll be talking a bit about St. Thomas Aquinas on free will. That'll be a bit shorter, like 30 minutes. I kind of want to spend some time not having to do stuff tonight before I have to go to bed and then get up for work tomorrow. But yeah, that's what will be going on. Okay, and I can actually answer this question right here. What objections do Anglicans have to becoming Western Rite Orthodox? With Anglicanism, especially continuing Anglicanism, there's what's called the branch theory that the Orthodox, Rome, and Anglican communions are all branches of one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that obviously ecclesiologically is in contradiction to Orthodoxy. So that lays a huge barrier. But I mean, other things, I can't think of really anything else that they would find problematic. Oh man, you brought all the books.
Sorry, forgive me. This way I can pull a J. Dyer and just start like pulling different like books out.
I read this book and I read this book.
So it was Dom Chapman Studies on the Early Papacy. This is from a Catholic perspective. This is really good. His Broken Body. This is from an Orthodox perspective. This is fantastic as well because at the end he actually kind of like makes some recommendations, kind of scholarly speculation on this is what reunion might look like, or things that we could do that can make reunion a bit easier. This is a part of it was the St. Vlad's Church History series on the Christian East. Where is it? Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. This is really good. And then, the Primacy of Peter in the Orthodox Church. This was edited by Meyendorff. There's a couple others, but there's one you'll see sometimes for like two paths: papal monarchy or collegial tradition. I read it. It was good. It's questionable. I know Eric Ibarra, like it's like very obscure video, but Eric Ibarra is like a 4-hour response to the first chapter of it that he posted on YouTube like 6 years ago. That's really good. But I'd recommend reading the book.
That video is about to have a massive spike in viewership. Yeah, I hasn't had a view in like 2 years.
This isn't a book, so forgive me. I'm also pulling on my another list here. It's not a book, but I Cabane the Christian or Seraphim Hamilton. On his YouTube channel, he has a couple of videos on why he's Orthodox rather than being Catholic. And talks about the papacy. I found those very useful. You Are Peter, an Orthodox theologian's reflection on the exercise of papal primacy. That's by Oliver Clement. That's really good. I'm trying to find some other Catholic books on the papacy that I really like. I guess that's a start. I'd say all of those are within the $15-$25 range. So that's it. Again, you always check thrift books first before you go anywhere else, or Abe books. But that would be a start on what I would start reading.
Yeah, you guys, I better not catching you stealing the PDFs. That's a no-no. that actually affects people's livelihoods. Okay, so there's a bunch of Union Jacks in the background. Are you a Brit by birth?
as much as I wish. No, no. It's when I was in middle school, I kind of just decided, you know what, I'm going to be like a Anglophile, and I just have ever since.
Yeah.
And so I just love. I am English by like heritage. You know, a lot of my, I'm most of my family is from one part of the British Isles or the other. But unfortunately, I am not. Oh, another Catholic book by Fortescue. I can't remember. Look up Adrian Fortescue. I know that he has a book on the papacy as well. But yeah, no, I just like England. I always have.
Yeah. So, Matthew, what would a mend of the schism look like to you?
I actually think of all people, Metropolitan Callistus Ware put this the best. He published a paper. If you Google this, you can find it as well. He's on the Orthodox Catholic Theological Commission, and he published a paper on primacy in the Orthodox Church. And Pope Emeritus Benedict has a quip that gets thrown around every once in a while that we, speaking of Catholics, cannot expect more of the Orthodox Church, of the Eastern churches, than what we expected of them in the first millennia.
Yeah.
And Metropolitan Callistus Ware says the Orthodox need to be willing to give Rome what we gave them in the first millennia. I think there needs to be concessions on either side. It makes me think of the story from Vatican I of the Melkite Patriarch who signed the dogmatic definition, adding a clause saying, I affirm papal infallibility and papal supremacy, as much as it does not violate the rights of the Eastern Patriarchs. I think if something like that could be agreed on, that's something mending the schism would look like. The Rome basically agrees to just not look even in the general direction of the East and leave us be, and not ever try to exercise any real level. Again, I find it's kind of an impossible exercise. I say all of that because, again, I think that Rome has backed itself into a dogmatic corner, and I even think the least ultramontanist position that you can take of Vatican I, because I recognize that we're kind of dealing with an ultramontanist time. This isn't necessarily what was intended by the Vatican I definition.
Yeah.
What we see now, I completely recognize that. But I even think at its best, it's not something that would be agreeable to Orthodoxy. I think Orthodoxy needs to be willing to admit some level of universal primacy or supremacy even. I think that Orthodoxy needs to be willing to accept that is a thing, and that primacy equals power. It's not just honor. Now, it maybe is more of a moral power or a moral authority than like an actual executive power. But I think that Rome would have to pull back on a couple positions it's not allowed to pull back on. I do not think you will ever see an Orthodox Christian.
I don't know. I think that we could have a more nuanced discussion about infallibility, because for example, like the tome of Pope Saint Leo, like that as an expression of the Roman Pontiff in council speaking for the whole church.
Yeah,
because you would agree he was speaking in persona ecclesia, and as his special role of chief of the patriarchs, speaking in that sense, we could venture to say that this is an infallible declaration coming from the Roman Pontiff,
perhaps
because of his role speaking in persona ecclesia, and the entire church not being able to err in matters of faith or morals. So I think in this more nuanced discussion,
I think you'd have to have a lot of theological designation, like distinctions signed in writing on both sides.
Yeah.
Because again, I think the Orthodox need to come together. I once heard an Orthodox Christian comment once, and I really liked what they had to say. One of the issues Orthodoxy has with papal supremacy and papal infallibility is it dogmatizes something that clearly was not agreed upon in the early church.
It wasn't even agreed upon in the medieval church.
Exactly, and so
to be honest,
it seems to be that there were different times in the early church. Rome exhibited a lot of authority that was listened to. Rome exhibited a lot of authority that wasn't listened to, and there's everything in between. And the problem a lot of Orthodox, or at least definitely a lot of Cradle Orthodox have, I think, is it forced the definition on something that I think they would argue is possibly impossible to find, because there was enough variation in the early church to say it's hard to even define what the early church position was on it.
Yeah.
Because again, also I think that a lot of, kind of going back to our pop apologist things, I think a lot of people try to bulldoze over the gray areas of the early church. Like we forget there was the Phocian Schism and the Acacian Schism and several schisms between the Eastern Patriarchs. Like the United Millennia was not that, like Voltaire always jokes, like the HRE was not Holy nor Roman nor an empire. Now, I think Voltaire's an idiot, and the HRE was Holy Roman and an empire, but that's beside the point. The United Millennium was not by any means united. It just was, on average, united between all of the patriarchs. But how can you call united when like a third of the church leaves at Chalcedon? Like come on, like that's kind of
I honestly thinking about how a united Eastern Western Church would look like. I think if we think about how the Pope of Rome interacted with the East in the first millennium, basically what you're going to have, even at the height of certain periods within the first millennium of Rome's power, what you're going to have basically is, if you have a fight between the patriarchs, like for example the Constantinople Moscow situation would probably be a situation where the Bishop of Rome would step in and be able to lay down the law, and then also calling of ecumenical councils, because that's
now that an emperor doesn't exist, I would concede that.
Who else is going to call the
who else is going to call? And that is an open question. We don't know what to do.
Very niche things like that. I'm sure there'll be meddling every
for that with the Council of Sardica, of this idea of the Pope being the highest court of appeals, and that's kind of the purpose of the Roman See. Again, the issue would be is how does supreme and immediate jurisdiction square with the apostolic canons, or of the Pope kind of intervening and being an immediate ordinary in a bishop's diocese, where the Orthodox are very uncomfortable with that idea. The Metropolitan cannot do that to any bishop that is under him, because they are bishops in their own right in their own sees. If I'm pretty sure I'm correct on this, the Metropolitan still has to ask permission to come to a diocese, because it's not his. So that is where I think you need Encyclopedia Britannica of definitions and distinctions and clauses. Like you need, it would be a lawyer's wet dream, of just writing this, tome that would be like, this is how and what Rome is allowed to do to the rest of us.
And even then, when it comes to what Rome has put on the table for reunion, when it comes to after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it's speaking basically as the definitions, as the councils in general, not binding the East in a different way than it would bind the West, in a much different way. And you see that in Eastern Catholicism.
Yeah.
I'm sure you would be, if you happen to be, by some weird situation, only able to go to an Eastern Catholic parish, I'm sure you'd be very, very careful, very, very comfortable with the canonical and theological and liturgical aspects of Eastern Catholic life. And I think I'm hoping at least that has been a good test case and a good, like, here East, this is how you would be treated. Like we're not, it's not going to be like it was the last time we dated. It's not going to be the same way.
Yeah,
we've changed.
Or the last time we Latinized everybody and caused St. Alexis Toth to happen, and
St. Alexis Toth.
Yeah, and he's canonized in the Orthodox Church.
Oh, really?
Yeah, St. Alexis of Wilkes-Barre. Yeah, one of the Pennsylvanian saints. But no, I agree. Like, that's even expressed whenever an Eastern Catholic bishop is consecrated, the Pope in Latin says, "I receive this bishop." But whenever a Western Catholic bishop is appointed, he says, "I appoint." So even actually in the language that Rome uses with the Eastern Catholic churches, there is admission that there's a slightly different relationship between them, where again he is receiving the fact that this church consecrated somebody a bishop, while in the Western Church he is appointing people.
Okay, there's a very important question. American Revolutionary War, based or cringe?
Absolutely cringe in just every way, shape, or
Every
form.
single one of my guests are saying cringe, and I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, let me look to see if there are any like really good questions, because I kind of need to at least start on my later live stream eventually. Okay, so doesn't look like there's anything else, except we have apparently we have a Rad Trad in the chat. We don't believe Christians, Muslims, and Jews worship the same God. Cult of modernism.
That's a base name at the very least. I got to give them that, you know.
Yeah, but Cult of Modernism. If you're not a Rad Trad, you meant this in complete goodwill. I'm sorry, but I've always taken that section from Lumen Gentium and the Catechism in the same sense, because Paul in Acts 17 was perfectly okay with saying that that the pagan Athenians were worshiping the same God he was worshiping. So I like to take it in that sense, that it's the unknown God that they've been reaching for, and that the Father by creation, whom they have, not Father by redemption, Father by creation. I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
When it comes to Islam, I'm undecided. That's just like a you know. I know
it's
different
a heresy,
people have said different things.
So,
yeah, so I'm like, yeah, whatever. I have a friend who converted from Islam to Roman Catholicism, and she makes the argument that Allah is not the same God as the Christian God. So I err on her side, just like, well, she'd know. But I think that's just not a topic I'm very committed to. Like whatever the church says, I don't really care.
Yep. So that's about it. Except John Fisher 2.0 is now arguing with Cult of Modernism in the comments. So you two continue
have
this
fun.
little.
Yeah, you have fun.
I don't want to get involved. You two can go at it. But yes, John Fisher 2.0, his argument. No, I'm not even gonna get on it. Not even gonna get in. I'm just gonna end it here. So plug anything you have. Let anybody know if you're doing any work, or if you're just a therapist with a Twitter.
I'm basically just a mental health worker with a Twitter. I write every once in a while. My friends and I have a thing called the Pondering Pub, which we're kind of working on reorganizing. Which is the way I always advertise is the poor man's Inklings. It started just getting together in my house, pouring some whiskey and talking about what we've been reading or writing or talking about. And I've written a couple things on that website before. But I don't really do much. I'm just a mental health worker with a Twitter that really likes to do armchair theology from time to time, or armchair ecclesiology, I suppose. But I'm very thankful to be brought on. It's been a really fun conversation. I love stuff like this.
Oh yeah, it was definitely great. We definitely in the future gotta come up with something else to talk about.
Happy to.
Yeah, especially
I'm happy to be the Orthodox punching bag.
No, I think especially that very good conversation partner when it comes to the relationship between the West and the East, coming from the perspective of somebody with a strong Western background and a strong appreciation for the Western patrimony.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I do my best to not be. I love to be hyperbolic in jokes and in private, but I would actually try to have an authentic dialogue. I just don't find it helpful. And if, like I said, it goes back to my divorced parents thing, but divorced parents analogy, not that I have divorced parents, but I'm so thankful to be on. So I really, really enjoyed myself.
Yep. So before you leave, everybody, and we remember about 10-15 minutes from now, I'm gonna get something to eat, and then we're gonna truck through some St. Thomas Aquinas on free will from Summa Theologiae Prima Pars. I think question 84, if I'm remembering correctly. Articles. No, I did that backwards. Article 84, question 1 and 2. I'm gonna go through that and explain it a bit. Kind of draw out those distinctions. We talked about predestination, and then obviously this question comes up. And then also join the Discord. That's the best way you could become more personally connected And then also,
I'm in the Discord, so if anybody watching has questions, feel free to ping me.
If you want to harass him, go ping him. Yeah, that's how you could reach him too. Also, remember, become a patron if you'd really like to be a helpful man and you'd really like to see this channel flourish, because it's been doing really good the last few weeks. And then about all my social medias. I don't even need to reiterate that. You all follow me on Twitter. You better. And then John Fisher and Cult of Modernism are still going in the comments. So Cult of Modernism, if you want to join the Discord, you're more than welcome if you want to continue this conversation. So that is all I have for you today. God bless, and thank you again, Matthew.
No problem. Thank you.